Alrighty, so I've got a pretty big video here for you. This is going to be a Planetary Qualifier prep guide. It's also going to be a meta update guide. So there's a lot of information here. I've been preparing for the Planetary Qualifiers that are starting in October. It's very soon, about a week and a half until the first round, and then we'll have a couple weekends going with these really big events. These events are going to be, they're going to vary in size, but I think at the minimum, there'll be like 60 to 80 people, and then some of them can go all the way up to about 128, I believe. So these will be representative events. Some of the higher level of competition I expect from most Star Wars Unlimited tournaments that we've seen so far. So I want to give you a pretty big rundown of how I'm preparing and what you need to do to prepare as well. Before we go, if you haven't, please subscribe to the channel. It helps out a lot, as well as checking out my Patreon, which has a lot of extra deck lists and up-to-date stuff about what I'm working on. All right, so first up, what's the goals of this video? First, it will be a pretty short section. It's an archetype review. I'm going to break down kind of what I see as the main pillars of this format in terms of the archetypes, aggro control and hard control or mid-range, things like that. I'll do a little bit about how to choose a deck, just some tips about what it is you need to wrap your head around before picking a deck. Then be a pretty big section on predicting the metagame. It'd be my current predictions, things that I expect to see, and kind of everything in between. And lastly, probably the largest section will be how to combat the decks. So this is going to be, not going to be mega in-depth on every deck, but it's going to be tips and tricks, I guess, on the top players in the metagame and what you need to look out for when playing against those decks. All right, so first up, archetype breakdown. You've probably seen this before if you've watched another one of my videos about a meta, but these are kind of the 5 pillars, as I call them, in the current metagame or in Star Wars Unlimited. Everyone kind of names these a little differently. Some people put different decks into different sections here, but I like to think about them as aggro. These are the lowest to the ground decks, ones that are really trying to get you dead as quickly as possible. The small, mid-range, and big mid-range decks. So I've split up mid-range because I identified that there's very big differences sometimes between the way the small and mid-range decks, something like a Boba Green deck plays, versus a big mid-range deck, which is like a Palp Green deck. I view Palp as the big mid-range and Boba as the little guy. And then likewise, I've also separated control decks into 2 different pillars. Soft control decks, the most standard deck here would be the blue-green villain control decks, like your Kira deck. And the hard control decks, something that is definitely on the rise right now, would be something like a Bosk blue deck. So these are very high density of events, and they typically try to close out games with either one big threat at the end or through milling or destroying your deck. So these are kind of the breakdowns. I'm going to go through now, in a moment, the metagame predictions, where I talk about which decks fit into which of these pillars. But next up, I wanted to do a little bit about how to choose a deck. So there's the biggest one here is thinking about what your comfort level is versus how good in aggregate or in general terms a deck is, right? If I'm really good at IG88 with yellow, versus I know Sabine Green is really good, but I don't play it well, which side of that should I be on? Now, when in my opinion, the range there is so massive that even if I'm not good at Sabine, I would take that over me being good at IG88. But there are areas kind of in between there where maybe you take something that is not considered as powerful, but you have much more of a deep understanding about how it plays into all the meta decks and how your lines into all the meta decks, and you've played it so much that you know what every card in your deck does, why it's there, how to use it. In that case, maybe playing that versus just being okay, well, Boba wins the last 3 of the last 4 events. This mono yellow Boba deck's really good. I should just pick it up this week, learn it a little bit, and then go with it. That might not suit you well. It might suit you better to be on the deck that you are more comfortable with. That's something for you to decide, of course. It's not for me to tell you. I just want to kind of call out that there is a lot to gain in this game from just knowing your lines. And sometimes that means playing something that you're more comfortable with, even if you don't think it's S tier, right? Now, I wouldn't go to D tier, but I might be okay with A tier in that case, and using my knowledge of the game and the deck in my favor, even though the power level might be slightly lower. Number 2 and 3 kind of go together. What do you want to exploit, and what are you okay losing to? So there's a lot of guesswork involved in going to a tournament. And if you're okay playing multiple decks, you then need to start deciding, well, which one do you think is positioned best? What decks do you want to exploit? What do you expect to be there? Now, when an event this big, like the Planetary Qualifiers, this is different than like a local scene where you know everyone and you know what everyone's bringing and you can target that much more. There's going to be locals, obviously, at your PQs, but there will probably also be a lot of people there that don't come to that shop very often, so you're not going to know exactly what to expect. But you can kind of get a pulse on the game if you're following recent tournament reports that are happening. There's lots of tournaments happening all over the world. There's one that was just a really big one that just happened in France a couple weeks ago or a week ago in Spain, in London. Or actually it was Manchester, but all over, right? So you need to follow these reports, see what's doing well, start getting an understanding of what might be there. So Sabine and Boba, they're going to be there, right? Do you want to exploit them? Probably yes. It's just tough to exploit everything. So you need to decide what you want to target, and then on top of that, what you're okay losing to. Are you okay being really good into a bunch of decks, but not very good into Sabine, something like, say, like a Palpatine deck? Or are you not okay losing to Sabine, but maybe you are okay losing into something like Palpatine, and then you play like smaller control decks that probably suffer a lot against Palpatine, but might be able to handle Sabine a little better. You need to decide this. Again, it's not for me to decide, but are you okay losing to Bosk Blue a lot? That's a deck that requires a very specific kind of targeting. It's a hard control deck. There's a lot of things and a lot of cards in your decks that are just not going to be good against the Bosk Blue deck. Are you okay with that being a bad matchup and not worrying too much about the cards you need for those really grindy hard control decks? Or are you not? And you decide. And that's going to help you choose which kind of deck you should bring. Lastly, and this is, I think, actually more important than some people think, is mirrors. You need to either opt in or opt out. Right now, if you're playing Sabine ECL, or if you're playing like Mono Yellow Boba, you are opting into playing mirrors. Frankly, both those decks are likely going to be about 20% each, give or take percentages. It's just my prediction. About a fifth of the meta is usually in these decks. Between the two of them, usually you get at least a third of the field. So if you're playing one of these decks, you're opting into playing mirrors, and some people don't like bashing mirrors all the time. They tend to be very swingy. Sabine mirrors especially rely a lot on certain cards to really kind of push them, like something like Rebel Assault being an absolute destroyer in the mirror, and you don't draw it and your opponent does, you're just going to feel bad, right? Or maybe you won't. Again, up to you. You need to kind of figure out if you're okay with mirrors, because if not, then you might not want to play one of the like decks that is represented that highly. All right, so we are in the predicting the meta section. So we talked about this a little bit. First in line, these two decks, I would be very surprised if at any PQ are not the top 2 represented decks. They have been basically the top 2 represented decks in every tournament I have seen so far. That is Sabine Green, and it is Boba Yellow. And these are both aggro decks in my mind. I don't consider either of these even remotely mid-range. They are trying to get you dead. They just do it a little differently. In fact, when they play each other, I often think the Boba is the aggro, and the Sabine ends up being the more controlling deck in that, because Sabine has a hard time racing through like Cunnings, but they have a really good time killing all of Boba's units, especially with something like a Poe that can one-shot Boba, and a lot of their units actually trade decently well at times. So these are my prediction that these will be the most represented decks, and you need to have a plan to combat them. You need to be picking a deck that either beats them, or if you are not beating one of these decks, you need to be very comfortable in most of your other matchups. It is okay to say that you are unfavored into one of these. It's very few things can be favored into both of these two, but you also need to be aware which one you're not favored to, and then go from there. One thing I would recommend, do not bring a deck that is unfavored into both of these, because about a third or more of your matches will likely be playing one of these two decks. So if you are unfavored into both of them, you are definitely starting on the back foot, and it is a tough place to be. All right, next up, these are my predictions for the next 3 most popular decks at these events. It'll be a Han Blue in the soft control pillar, Kira Green in the soft control pillar, and Bosk Blue. Now, Bosk is definitely kind of the newcomer here. He's just been doing really well. Just won a tournament in France, won a tournament in Spain. It's being played a lot now. And I think, frankly, a lot of people just like hard control decks, and they haven't been very good until recently with this Bosk deck. And now I think it might even be more represented than it should be, because it's new and people have been wanting to play something like this. And it's been winning. So what do you do with these? You need to be aware that they exist. These are all control decks. They are decks that are trying to obviously stop you from playing cards, destroying your units. They just do it a little differently. Bosk with pure events, Kira and Han definitely fight more with their units, but they will be popular likely, and they are all good decks. And then the last section here, well, almost the last section, but this is other decks I think will be there. They probably won't be there in massive numbers, but I'm pretty confident in saying that they will be around. That is something like Boba Green in the small mid-range, or Mono Yellow Han, also small mid-range, right? I think these decks both slant more aggressive, although there are 2 variations to Boba Green right now. There's like 30 health, really grindy Boba Green with something with like Cobb Vanth, and it really tries to grind. And then there's like ECL Boba Green, which is still like grinding, especially if it plays like Vaders and Mauls and Reinforcement Walkers, but also has more explosion and tries to close games out a little quicker. Same with Han Solo. It is an aggressive deck. Because it's in my mind a little slower than Sabine and Boba Yellow and plays more interaction with the discard, I knock it down into this small mid-range peg. And then lastly, this Palpatine green deck. I think Palpatine tends to be more popular than it should be, because it does kind of get crushed by Sabine, and I actually also think it's unfavored into Mono Yellow Boba. So like I said before, that would be a tough thing for me to justify at a big event, being what I imagine is unfavored into both of those first in line decks. But it is also kind of good into a lot of stuff, and is a very polarizing deck. It has like extremes on both ends. So, but you know, people really like Palpatine, and it is going to be there. It's been floating around, 5%, 10% in that range, but I expect it to be around. And then there's everything else, and there will be everything else. These are just some of the everything else. There's definitely things not on this list that will show up or could show up. It's very hard to predict. Like Cad Bane decks, right? There's Cad Bane Red and Cad Bane Blue are both like getting played. Kylo Yellow is like in turbo aggro. Rey is usually around either as a mono blue deck or with red. Tarkin Yellow is still floating around there, kind of the de facto I'm trying to cheese you out with lurking TIE Items deck. Bosk Green, a good deck that also will probably be there. Might have even needed to be up a tier in this one in terms of like how comfortable I'm saying it'll be around, but at the very least I expect some of it. Han Solo Green, it also will likely be there, and very many other things. Now, this is not a section where I can say you can prep for all this. It's really tough to prep into everything. You're just gonna have to like say some of these decks fit into different pillars, like the Rey Red, very similar to the Han Blue. Maybe I don't need to test specifically against that. The Tarkin Yellow, I mean, just knowing that it's trying to cheese you with lurking TIE Items. Do you have answers to lurking TIE Items in your deck? How many? Are you comfortable with that matchup? So you just have to pick and choose what you can play against. The ones above this in the list are definitely decks that I would say get some reps into here. If you have time and energy, you can definitely test some more. All right, so now we get into the strategy section. So this is how to combat the top decks, right? So we're going to go through the ones in those first 3 lists, and I'm going to give some ideas of things that you need to look out for in these decks. This is not going to be like how to beat them with a deck. It's more just what to look out for, how these decks play, and attention points. So we'll start with Sabine Green, probably going to be the most popular deck. So the things that you need to look out for here, right? Most people have probably played against this a lot, but you need to really be aware of the ECL Poe and ECL Wrecker stuff. Now, easier said than done, but in a way, you also need to think about the math involved with these cards. Poe, for instance, is there a way for you to mitigate it from killing 2 of your units, right? Are you able to make it so that you don't have a second unit that only has 2 health, so that Poe can't throw something at it and kill something with his ambush? Obviously, you need to be aware of the upgrade hate that is on that card. Are you able to set up a turn so that Poe ends up with enough damage on him after an ambush so that you can kill it with whatever comes next? Notably, Poe does one-shot Boba Fett. It's a huge issue in that matchup for Boba. It's probably the biggest problem he has with the Sabine decks in general. Boba Yellow, I would still say, is really solid into Sabine, but that one-shot ambush is a big deal. So be aware of that. Further in this curve, you've got Wrecker. So how do you mitigate as much damage from that overwhelm ambush as possible? Or how do you make it so that whatever Wrecker has to ambush into, you can then cleanly kill it? It's the same thing with Poe. A big issue with these units is if they ambush you and you can't kill them, they then present a massive amount of damage to your base the next turn. And that's the biggest key in these Sabine decks, because they're mostly chipping damage for the first 3 turns, and then that's how they kill you. And if you can make those big ambush turns a bit worse, you're going to be in a decent spot. The other major tension point here is Darksaber. There's a lot of decks that just can't handle that card. I tend to say those decks probably can't really exist in general, because if you can't beat a Darksabered Sabine, you're going to be in big trouble. But how do you kind of combat a Darksaber from coming down against Sabine? That's being able to churn as much action before that Sabine flip, being able to force her to do something else before she flips. Because it eats up the whole turn and requires Sabine to flip first, in many ways you are allowed to spend your turn doing as much with your resources as you can, and then just forcing them to flip into whatever units you already have in play so that you can get some damage onto her before she puts a Darksaber on that unit. A big issue you'll have is if you're not able to put any damage into Sabine, you're not able to stall any actions, and she flips, gets a saber on, gets an attack off, and then she still has 8 health going into the next turn. That's a major problem. You are allowed to take 1 hit from a Darksabered Sabine, but if you take 2, there's probably no way you're ever going to win that game. So that's another thing you need to consider. Confiscate in the main deck is not the worst idea anymore, especially if Boba's armor is also a card that gets played. Past that, there is always being aware of like the action sequencing and whether or not giving Sabine initiative into the next turn is okay versus preventing a damage from the ping. If you claim into a Sabine, it almost always means they'll ping before they claim, and then you're taking 1 extra damage, while sometimes you want to push damage yourself even if it means losing initiative, because it'll mean they won't ping that turn, and then they'll certainly be able to attack you next turn with whatever they have initiative with. But if there was no way for you to prevent that attack anyway, then them having initiative might actually be favorable for you, not only from the ping prevention standpoint, but also from the action economy standpoint. It means that they will always be taking an action before you, so you will always be able to react to them. And most decks want to react into Sabine because they are almost every deck you're playing will be the control in the matchup. That is not always the case for a Boba Yellow deck that can often push tons of damage itself. So there's more tension with that initiative, but that is something to always look for with Sabine, is whether or not even you want to have initiative going into the next turn. In many cases you do, if you have a unit that can kill something or a card in hand that can be a removal for whatever they have in play and prevent some damage. But in many cases, you don't always want to answer what they have in play. You want to answer the bigger thing that's going to come after. So these are just some things to look out for in Sabine. They're kind of the key elements. The most powerful cards in this deck right now really are Darksaber, Poe, and Wrecker. There are 3 new cards. They really elevated this deck. They gave it, the Darksaber gave it a much different angle than anything else. The Poe Wrecker gave it much more longevity than it used to have. And they are important cards to always have in your head as like, what can I do to mitigate their impact on this game? And what cards can I play to make it so that they don't absolutely blow me out? All right, next up as the top of the list decks are Boba Fett Yellow. So this is another very aggressive deck. It fights on a different axis than Sabine because it does interact more, notably through bouncing your stuff a lot and just getting ahead on board and then having an absolute beast of a leader to really push damage and really help deploy more units. They play a lot of shielded units, which is something you need to be aware of. So removal that goes through shields, obviously more important. This stuff tends to be in blue. If you're going to try to fight this deck, you need to minimize the impact of the bounce. Big chunky units that don't do much when you play them are the weakest here out of any matchup. It's really tough to play them, especially units with 4 health that can also get bounced by Cunning. Cunning is the strongest card in this deck, other than maybe Fett's Fire Spray. But Cunning, you need to be aware of the +4 and how you can mitigate that if possible. It's tough for them to play Cunning into open resources because if you can then interact with whatever they buffed, they'll have a problem. They lose a ton of steam if they don't get that attack off. So presenting choices for your opponent so that they can't just willy-nilly throw a Cunning down and just blow you out is good. So bounce, playing around Cunning. Lurking Ties are more present now in Boba decks, although Lurking Ties are very useless in the mirror and pretty bad against Sabine as well. So Lurking Tie in this deck in general, if you were playing it, is tough sometimes to justify in the main deck, but it's very good into some decks. So the decks that get hurt by Lurking Tie, like control decks, need to be ready to answer it with things like Make an Opening or smaller space units that can trade it off before it starts getting going. Mitigating the Boba flip turn is obviously, again, easier said than done, but not presenting a really clean target for something like Bosk or Cantina Bouncer or Syndicate Lackeys will help you from letting that turn get absolutely out of hand. Boba's Armor is another card that some decks do not care about at all. Sabine doesn't care at all because they can Poe it, but some decks do. Control decks have a harder time dealing with it outside of cards like Power of the Dark Side, especially control decks in heroes that can't even play that need, like Han Blue, for instance, has a really hard time with that card and can get absolutely rolled through, even if they have Rivals Fall, because they're usually going to end up taking a bunch of damage first and then taking even more damage than from something that comes the next turn, like Fire Spray. And then we get to Fire Spray, of course, which is a major card, but you need to be aware when you can and can't afford to take 5 damage from it, because often taking 5 damage from it is okay if you can stabilize the next turn, especially if you can completely lock down the ground. It means that unless they can chain Fire Sprays, which, you know, they'll do sometimes and win that way, then you should be able to come back from that. Boba Fett is a fantastic deck. It is very good into some stuff, but it also just rarely gets completely blown out. I think its weakest matchups tend to be blue villain control decks. But even then, it sometimes can sneak wins. Lurking Ties, it's got some discard. And of course, it just does such a powerful thing, having just an immensely powerful leader that even into bad matchups, it can definitely steal some games. It does have what I think is a slightly favorable matchup into the other deck we just talked about, which is Sabine, another deck that doesn't really get blown out by much. So that's why both of these decks are at the top of this list. They both have game into everything, including their bad matchups. I would take Boba side in the heads up, but I think Sabine has more potential to blow out more decks because it just does something much more linearly powerful than Boba does. Surprisingly, because they both are completely nuts decks. But yeah, so these are just some tips for those two, and we're going to keep going. All right, so let's talk about some Young Han Blue. So this is basically a control deck in my mind. It plays a lot of interaction, event-based. It tries to do trades with units. It's got healing. It's got an entire discard angle. So we'll start with the discard stuff. That's not going to be effective into a lot of decks, but into the decks that it is, what you need to really watch out for here is not letting your hand shrivel before you get pillaged or K2'd or force thrown kind of all at once. Best ways to interact with their units to avoid this is not creating 1-for-1 trades with things like K2 or Yoda, both which create 2-for-1s in those situations. So you want to actually trade into their units with your bigger units so that you can stay ahead in cards. That way, there's also angles you can take sometimes by not playing a card on turn 1. Han Blue deck is a pretty slow deck to get going, so it's often okay to kind of fall behind a little bit on the first turn to insulate your hand a little bit. Getting rid of their force units, of course, if you're worried about force throw, is very important. And then playing with Smuggle also helps insulate a little bit about the discard plan. And in general, just being ahead makes the discard plan less good. As far as if you're trying to aggro them, the restore units are the ones that are most problematic. And also keep in mind that their removal, other than Carabast, is a little slow. I mean, they have open fires, but open fires aren't actually that great into a lot of aggressive units. There's a lot of 3/5s and shielded units. On top of that, Takedown and Fell the Dragon usually eat up a whole turn. And then past that, you've got Rivals Fall. This deck struggles a bit with upgraded units. Something like a Dark-Sabered Sabine or a Boba Armor can be a big problem for this deck. Rivals Fall really is, in this case, one of the few things that can interact cleanly with a Boba, other than doing something like a -6/-6 with Luke the turn after. So upgrades can be effective here. Of course, my favorite thing to do into this deck, kind of no matter what I'm playing with, is to kill the Han leader on the 6 resource turn, which prevents a Luke deploy on 6 resources. So that is the most powerful play this deck has. It's the Luke on 6. It's kind of the premise of this whole deck. And if you're able to shut that down, that's pretty good. And often cases, you're going to be able to kill Han on his flip turn, the 5 resource turn. But if you do that, you are essentially letting them play Luke the next turn because Han will be in the leader spot and then be able to use his ability. But if you're able to set it up so that you defeat the Han on the 6 resource turn, he can no longer use his ability as a leader. He'll be exhausted and you are delaying that Luke deploy, which is a pretty big deal in a lot of matchups. Overall, this deck does function pretty well into a lot of things. It doesn't really get blown out. It has the interaction. It does grind really well because it plays things like Tech and that discard plan, and like I mentioned, Yoda and K2 are both 2-for-1s. Luke is a 2-for-1, so there's a lot of grinding potential here. Discard, again, is a mechanic that you can often play around, especially Force Throw, which is the most powerful card in the deck, if not Luke, because of how cheap it is and the absurd amount of value you can get out of it. So those are a few things to look out for. Yeah, let's go down to the next. All right, so now we've got Bossk Blue. So this is a pretty new deck. All things considered, it kind of made a splash recently. It's getting pretty popular. And I wanted to talk about this because hard control is not something that has been forefront in the metagame. So this is an event-based deck. There's almost no units. Like the units it plays are Lieutenant Charlton, which is an important one to consider, and then mostly big things to help close out games, things like Avenger, Palpatine, Crate Dragon, so that stuff. And then a bunch of 1-for-1 removal, like all the stuff. Power of the Dark Side, Takedown, Fell the Dragon, Rivals Fall, Make an Opening, whatever you want. Open Fire, Force Choke, all that stuff's going to be in there. The one kind of not 2-for-1 removal stuff they do is Super Laser Blast, which is, again, a very important card. And then that's it. Some healing with Vigilance and the Client, and then the bounties. And we'll start with the bounties because that is what separates Bossk from basically all the other hard control decks. It's playing Top Target and it's playing Deathmark. Two cards that are used in very, very different situations. So top target is the burst heal that Bosk gets into aggressive decks. It can heal up to 12 when Bosk is deployed. And Deathmark is the card advantage engine. So this deck, I still think, struggles a little bit into Sabine, even with all the giant healing it provides, especially with that top target. It's just that it really is slow to get going. It's really answering on a 1-for-1 rate. Lieutenant Charlton is kind of that linchpin there. If you're able to mitigate how good a Charlton will be into you, especially if you're a deck that's trying to be aggressive. Now, Boba has bounce. It's really good into Charlton. Sabine sometimes needs to do things like Spec Force or use their ECL, especially with something like Poe. That can be effective. If you're able to kill Bosk before he gets a double trigger, that's effective, and that's going to be effective kind of no matter what. It's very hard to do in many cases, especially for control decks, because Bosk himself doesn't actually play that many units, and he's going to be able to stall until he can deploy and usually squeeze in something like a Deathmark or a top target. So one double trigger is usually all you want to give them. If you can't do the 0, which is hard, you don't want them getting 2 double bounty triggers. So top target, that's for Boba, that's for Sabine. You got to be aware it's there. I wouldn't recommend doing things like Confiscate for those decks into that. Although, on the off chance that you do have enough things to take out, it's not the end of the world to do it. Basically, what you want to try to do is match them card for card. That becomes more difficult in grindy games when they get death marks off. There's not much for control decks or grinding decks to do into that. They just have to play on their own card advantage engine and always present more threats than the boss that can answer one at a time, because until Super Laser Blast, it really only answers threats one at a time. And then if you're playing like a hero control deck, you get access to a bunch of removal, like not a bunch of removal, a bunch of discard like the Han deck, and a bunch of grind from like Tech. And if you're playing a villain control deck, it's really about Relentless, getting that down and basically blanking this entire deck, especially if you're able to chain Relentlesses and force them to burn events and then kill Relentless, and then you can play it again or do something like Palp's Return, right? So that's how you can really just kind of tax them. Card 2-for-1 units, so something like Vader also is a very good card here, because again, they work primarily on 1-for-1 axis. It's light on bounties. Bosk, you want to be aware that the pings, so like units with 1 health, less effective here. So you might want to start your game not with your 1 health units, like a Greedo, right? That could be a pretty big liability leading off into a Bosk. So best ways to get under is to get under them with hard aggression, or if you're going to try to grind with them, you're going to have to pick how you're doing that, either through mass discard potentially or through Relentless, right? That's usually how I would target that. On top of that, this is a very polarizing matchup, and this is the extreme end on the opposite side of aggro. This hard control stuff, it's really hard to like prepare both for this and Sabine. It's like a very wide range of things to do, and it does lead back to the original point of like, what are you okay losing into? What are you not okay losing into? What do you want to exploit? Because it's hard to really target everything going on right now, especially now that we have a prominent hard control deck. All right, next we got Kira Green. I've championed this deck for a while. So how do you want to fight this? First things first, 3 power units on her flip turn are a problem sometimes, because she gets a free kill on them. She turns into a 7 power unit. That could be a big deal. Another thing, because of this, 4 power units somehow become much better, right? If you're able to play a 4 power unit, Kira's flip isn't great. She can't really trade with that unit effectively, and then next turn you would be able to kill that Kira with that unit if they did something else with her. So that's one thing. The other thing, discard. So mass discard can be good sometimes into this deck, but it's not always, and it's usually only effective if you're able to back it up with pressure and force this deck to react to your board, play cards out, and then you can hit the remaining cards. I just don't think you should go into this plan with just like, oh, I've got pillages and I'm gonna win, because it doesn't really work that way. On the other hand, targeted discard, things like Spark or Rebellion, can be quite good, especially early in the game when they are trying to set up some very important turns. Usually that involves ramping or the payoff card from the ramp. It can really set them back if you're able to nag a really important piece. Bodhi can do that in a way, although this deck is primarily unit based, so Bodhi is much less good. But like the mono yellow Han has access to all this discard stuff. It's a potential way to target it, although I don't think the mono yellow Han targets his deck particularly well, because so many of its units have 3 power, and actually Kira's flip is actually incredibly devastating into that deck. But if you're able to either early aggression and force Kira on the back foot, or grind with her, then you've at least got a plan. Kira, just like the Han blue deck, is a deck that is not usually getting blown out by anything. It has game into most things. That's kind of the point of these like soft control decks, is that they have answers to a lot of things. They are sturdy decks. They don't get like demolished by anything. Now, if you want to go bigger than her, something like Palpatine, especially Palpatine Blue, for instance, then you've got the same top end as this Kira deck, but you've also got like a bigger leader, and that can be a problem. The other thing you always need to look out for is the shields. If you're able to, you just be aware of them happening. If you're able to push damage into units so she can't shield, or you need to be prepared for like how you're handling something if it gets shielded. At the same token, if you're playing this deck, don't just throw shields on and put things into removal range that it wouldn't have already been, like takedown, for instance. All in all, it's tough to really exploit this deck, in my opinion, but it's also like, it's not impossible to beat it. I think you just need to be proactive with what your game plan is, and then try to make her flip turn as awkward as possible. Be aware of like what's going to happen as they ramp, right? If they ramp and then they've got that 5 resource turn, well, if they're playing barrage, you need to be aware that that's happening. So mess with the barrage math. Are you able to present more than 6 health on the board so that 6 damage barrage, which often happens, doesn't kill more than one thing? That's a major pivot point if you're able to set that up. If they're playing energy conversion lab, of course, you need to know what could be coming, like a Gideon or a Lone Pike, and be like, it doesn't mean you can always play around it, but you need to know it's coming so that you know what you're going to do on your next turn. Yeah, Kira Green. All right, next we got the last 3 I'm going to do, and they are probably like a step down from how popular they are, but Boba Green, this is definitely less aggressive than Mono Yellow Boba. It, again, is a ramp deck. It wants to ramp and create an absolute nutty 5 resource turn with his deploy. So mitigating how good that deploy can be is important. If you don't give them a target, for instance, to ambush with like Bosk or whatever 5 drop they're going to play, if they're playing energy conversion lab, that also means Zuckuss. So if you go space, for instance, they might not be able to create an 8 resource turn. On the other hand, if you're trying to control them, knowing what's going to happen on that flip, the best things they do usually are either a 5 drop unit, like Bosk, an overwhelming barrage that turn. So just knowing what could happen. Boba's armor, of course, is another card you need to consider. They might not even be going for an 8 resource turn. They might just need a 7 resource turn, like a 5 and then a Boba's armor. They might just flip so that they can preemptively Boba's armor. That's also in play. The top end for these decks, either the ECL version or the 30 health, usually does involve some combination of Vaders and Mauls and up to Reinforcement Walker. These decks sometimes also play things like Palp's Return and Choose Sides, especially out of the sideboard. If they're playing the super grindy version that plays like Cobb Vanth and Patrolling V-Wing, I would definitely be looking out for Choose Sides, which can blow you out if you are not ready, which means you want to kill the cheap units. And another power play this has is the early Underworld stuff with McClunky and Bazine, potentially Salacious Crumb and other cheap Underworld units. So if you're able to lock down those Underworld units so that those McClunkies don't get you as hard, that'd be good. Bazine is a card to look out for. And with just globally, I want to talk about like the discard stuff in general, especially with targeted discard like Bazine or Bodhi or Kira, the unit. You want to think about how to keep your hand redundant into these strategies. If you're starting a game on the draw against Boba Fett green, and you know they're playing Bazine, maybe you don't resource all your 2-drops because they might, if you do, and they Bazine you and they hit the other one and you have to skip your first turn, that could be a problem. Or for instance, you have a hand with 2 ramp and you're like, I only need to ramp once in this deck. Well, against these decks that have Bazine or something like Bodhi, you might want to just keep both for a turn so that you can ensure you're going to play that. Same with Boba Yellow. You need to be aware of Fire Sprays coming and how many hits you can afford to take from that. I like this deck. I think Boba Green is quite good. I still think it's not played a ton. I mean, it's certainly going to be played and it's on this list for a reason, but look out for it. All right, next up is Han Yellow. So I did mention briefly some of the cards in this deck, like the discard angle. So this does have a much more targeted discard angle than the Han Blue deck that we talked about because it plays Spark, Bodhi, Kira, things like that. So keeping your hand redundant, same thing I mentioned with Bazine, is important into these decks. The turn 1 on this deck, outside of Spark, usually involves them playing a 3-drop. So you're going to have initiative going into the next turn. If you have a good way to answer their 3-drop, that's pretty good, especially if it's something like Ezra. Helps a lot. Millennium Falcon is another card can come out on turn 1. I am usually a fan of keeping Millennium Falcon in play because it's going to start eating their resources. It's going to make their turns more awkward. Cunning, same thing that we mentioned with the Boba Yellow. It is the power card, being able to know when you're able to play around it, when you can hold up resources to defeat something that might get pumped, is important. Overall, what this deck does is try to make your game as awkward as possible. It actually does play some lower powered cards overall, but it's trying to protect its main game plan with a bunch of different targeted discard and just shenanigans, right? It's playing bounce as well. There's smuggle stuff like hot shot blasters. It's trying to capitalize on you stumbling and then kind of taking off from there by using Han's very innately powerful resource ramp and then his pretty early deploy, right? He can come out on the 5 resource turn and create a 7-drop if needed. Also look out for the DJ tech combo. This is the deck that kind of runs that thing. So if they're going to tech you on turn 2, you need to know that they theoretically could DJ you that turn by using Han's ability. So playing around that. And sometimes if you know they're going to go for it, you might want to let them first resource ramp and then defeat something like the tech so that they might be in a really awkward spot. Those units aren't too hard to kill, but you certainly can't fall asleep. Also know that even if you're going to let them DJ you and then maybe kill the DJ, just remember that it can stop your leader from deploying if it gets below, it hits you below those resource thresholds where you would deploy. So sometimes you just have to preemptively deploy if you have nothing to do against the combo because you've insulated yourself a little bit. All right, next is Palpatine Green. So this, I think, is the most popular Palpatine deck. Parts of exploiting Palpatine Green is all Palpatine. So what I really like doing is killing all their units, which I know is weird because this deck, I mean, this isn't really a control deck, but it's like slow and going big. So like we want to aggro them, right? That's usually the mindset. But I think if you shut down their draw engine, you're going to be feeling pretty good. It also stops them from being able to essentially set up really good Palp flip turns if you defeat a lot of their units. So kill a bunch of stuff. Their units early are pretty weak. The other thing is this deck basically doesn't play good removal outside of Overwhelming Barrage. If you can keep them from using a devastating Overwhelming Barrage, it's going to be pretty good for you. So again, that involves killing units or especially killing chunky units, something like their 5/5, the Enterprising Lackeys. Another thing that hits this deck pretty hard is shields, because this is a mono green deck. Like we just said, there's barely any removal. It's either bashing things with units or using something like Overwhelming Barrage. Of course, they can Palp ping those shields, but it's very slow and clunky, and it, of course, doesn't leave damage on the unit for the Palpatine flip. So shields are good, which, you know, they're all over the place in a lot of decks. It's a big reason why I think like Yano Yellow Boba is pretty good into this deck. They got the shielded units. They've got good space, which is another way to exploit this deck. Its space units are miserable It's a weak deck to something like Phantom. The deck obviously needs to be playing things like Black Suns and other space units just to deal with that stuff, but slim pickings for the Palpatine. And the last thing is mitigating the flip. So you know it's coming, unless you're playing Sabine, right? Like Sabine, you just kill them. Like that really the trick to beating Palpatine green is play Sabine, but if you're gonna want to do it with something else, mitigating the flip, right? So how do you do that? Well, obviously you can't throw your haymakers out. One of the best units Emperor Palpatine can steal is something like Obi-Wan. I think it makes these like hero mid-range decks really struggle, or like these hero control decks struggle into Palpatine because they're not quite quick enough to get under him, and they usually can only pose real problems for him once they start playing their big cards. So him being able to steal that stuff becomes a problem. But if you're able to just like force their hand, right, either through some aggression through some aggression, not too much, but some, then you're able to get them to flip, and then you have to try to equalize after that. If you've gotten enough pressure in to force a kind of a weak flip, you should be feeling pretty good. The other thing is you can work on a reset. So if you are playing villain blue, things like Super Laser Blast is obviously something that you need to be playing towards. You force the flip, you reset the board, and then you hope that your top end can be better than theirs. In a lot of cases, it will be, because again, this is a mono green deck. It doesn't have access to like some of the more potent finishers, specifically something like Avenger or its own Super Laser Blast. Crate Dragon as well, in decks that need to run that, can be good, especially if you've done early pressure, because this deck can't kill Crate Dragons particularly easily. There is no removal in this deck that isn't damage based, and Crate Dragon has 10 health. So tell me, how does Palpatine Green really deal with that? It deals with it by killing you before it kills him a lot of the time, but that's only possible if you haven't pushed damage. So pushing damage, getting to a crate can be very effective here as well. All right, so that's like just some tips, pointers for like what I think are probably the 8 most common decks that are going to be played. Of course, there's way more things that are going to happen, but I cannot give you a deep dive on every single deck that will possibly be played. I hope this was helpful. Let me know what you think. Let me know if you think I missed any decks. Of course, I know there's some that will be played. So, but if you think there's something that like is glaringly a glaring omission, then definitely let me know. Yeah, and I hope you liked it. Subscribe, check out the Patreon, and until next time, take care.